is a community of common concern. And in the early 1990s, in a really innovative consultation program, Albury City Council consulted everybody downstream through quite an innovative system where they had a series. This was in the early days of sort of internet and link-ups, but they had satellite beaming of TV to RSL halls all the way down the river, talking about and saying, this is what we plan to do, what do you want to do? What do you want us to do? And ironically, they put in place this system where they didn't let any of their sewage get back into the river system. And it's put into a series of wetlands, the Wonga wetlands, and it's very, very effective in terms of water treatment, but now people are saying that system is so good that it's being wasted on wetlands, this water should actually go back into the river because the water has a huge value environmentally and economically. So an interesting example of how community values might change over time. In the early 90s too, there was another consultation process in the Murray River involved with Turrumbary Weir. So Turrumbary Weir is a 10-15 metre high dam across the Murray River, which is really important for irrigation and tourism in the Echuca Kerrang area. And that weir started to fall down in the early 1990s and had to be fixed at great cost. And the local community was consulted about whether they wanted it replaced. And not surprisingly, they said yes, because their industry, their tourism, their livelihood was totally dependent on that. So a very local consultation process got a understandable result. If you'd run a consultation process across the whole Murray-Darling Basin, I think you would have got a very different result, with people saying, no, you should knock that down, and that water should not be used in those areas, and that water should migrate to other areas where there's not such a high environmental cost. So that water has been used to irrigate, in many cases, pasture, and many people would argue that watering pasture for dairy cows is not the most effective use of that water. The dairy farmers in that area run a very passionate and effective argument that they have an interest. They've lived in those areas in some cases for 3 generations, and they should be allowed to keep using that area. So quite a good example of conflicts over when you consult the community. I was walking into work yesterday listening to Radio National, and the Mersey Valley Hospital was back on the news. So this is a hospital that became involved in the election campaign late last year, when the then federal government said they would take it over and keep it going. And the local community, if you're asked in Burnie, will always say they want a hospital, but medical experts are saying there's only enough resources to have one hospital in that whole region, and there needs to be a centralisation of resources. So some community members taking the broader view say we should have one hospital, but local people in the local town are arguing for their individual hospital. So again, all these issues of scale are really important in community participation, and think about who's going to want what type of outcome. So communities are another form of community. So individuals can be involved in more than one community simultaneously, depending on the issue, and that's something again that I suspect some of you will reflect on in the tutorials. They can vary between local and global. I'm really interested in how the internet is changing people's sense of community. So they can be based on a range of things such as location, race, culture, gender. I'm on an internet group where people swap information and details about Van Morrison concerts. So I go to my one and only trip to Belfast. I knew which pub to go into to meet all the band fans before a concert, and that's an international community that people can get together at any time. So also we need to be critical about participation. So participation is just not a given. It can mean different things in different settings. So this is a wonderful quote that participation is like a kaleidoscope. So you've all seen those toys that kids have. You look through it, you turn these things, and depending how you twist, you see these different things. So it changes colour and shape at the will of the hands in which it is held. And just like the momentary image in the kaleidoscope, it can be very fragile and elusive, changing from one moment to another. The kaleidoscope analogy fits because participation is a complex and dynamic phenomenon seen from the eye of the beholder and shaped by the hand of the power holder. So that's quite a powerful quote about what participation is and how it changed from your perspective. Now, those of you who have done SRES 1001 will have heard of Alistair Gregg's understandoscope and this how we see the world. Here's another example of people are going to see participation very differently depending on where they stand on a particular issue and who has the power. So again, an issue that I hope you'll work through in your tutorials, the issue of power in the public participation process, and when and why not in some cases are people prepared to hand power over. In the land care movement, there have in many cases been calls for people in government to hand over, or government officials to hand over more power to local communities and consult them or actually give them some authority in terms of land management. And some land managers, some government people, the expert extension officers have been quite happy to do that, and they're interested in community models of participation, but other people perhaps trained in previous times when he, and they usually were male, was the expert, are less happy to hand over that kind of power and authority. So public participation can be empowering. Ideally, public participation results in community empowerment and devolution of decision making to the right level, to the local or regional communities. And this is something I hope we get to in some detail in the regional planning tutorial. So there's something very exciting happening in Australia in terms of Australia being divided up into 56 regional areas in terms of the planning process. And you really should all be conscious of that, because there's extraordinary job opportunities for people like yourself out in those regions. Same small areas in Queensland, they're big areas but with a small number of people and resources, and only 1 or 2 people are doing all the environmental planning for a quarter of Queensland. So that person needs to have some integrative skills in terms of social policy, in terms of environmental policy, in terms of biophysical science, in terms of understanding social processes. Very, very interesting work in terms of then having to consult people over that wide area. So inherent in this devolution is an acknowledgement of the value of local knowledge and the ways of doing things. And again, this is something I'll explore in more detail in a subsequent lecture when I talk about Indigenous knowledge and how Indigenous people talk about how wisdom lies in places. So the rhetoric, the justification for public participation is that the community out there, whether it be a community that's been involved in forestry for 4 generations, or whether it's an Indigenous community that's lived in the area for 1,000 generations, they do have local knowledge about that area and have a stake and deserve to be consulted and involved in how those resources are managed. And particular interest to me as a geographer is the degree in which this local knowledge takes the form of reading the landscape, understanding the skills. So I've talked to 5th or 6th generation farmers about a local area, and they have that same knowledge, that same kind of knowledge that traditional elders have, because they've learned from their fathers, their grandfathers, their great-grandmothers about that landscape. They know when the tea tree is flowering or smells in a particular way, it means the water table is coming up or going down. There's really detailed bits of local knowledge which a bureaucrat sitting in Canberra or Melbourne or Sydney is unlikely to know, and if they develop a policy which ignores that, it's not likely to be effective. I've already hinted at the fact that public participation can be very, very, very tokenistic. So governments, if they want to, can keep a lid on communities by setting up important processes that diffuse rather than harness community energies. And I think many of you in your tutorial exercise are going to be asked to think about public participation processes which haven't worked. And often they haven't worked because the person setting it up didn't want it to work. In the late 90s, there was a thing called Local Area Planning Advisory Committees in Canberra, and I was a representative from O'Connor Turner talking about, the main business was about urban planning in the ACT, and I felt quite strongly that the people who set that up didn't necessarily want it to work. Committees were very, very poorly resourced, so it was all voluntarily. We met at one stage for 6 hours a week for 6 or 7 weeks, developing a strategy and policy to talk about how big a footprint a house could have on a block in O'Connor Turner, trying to avoid neighbours being overshadowed, trying to maximise solar orientation of houses. And we got absolutely nowhere because we weren't actually, the government wasn't actually interested at that time, I suspect, in hearing that. So often government can set up processes actually to keep the lid on the community by setting up quite impotent processes that diffuse rather than harness community energies. So when we reflect on what works in public participation, I think there's some quite key things, there's some characteristics of the process which are effective. So we need to think about issues of power, resources, information, and these need to be fairly distributed. So if the power lies in all in one place, and if the local community, even someone like myself who's teaching environmental policy course, doesn't understand and doesn't have access to the full complexities of the ACT planning law and how that affects planning applications for dual occupancies in O'Connor, it's going to be very difficult for community members to actively engage in the process if there's not a fair distribution of resources and